Concrete dust doesn't wash out. It settles in your lungs, coats your throat, and tastes like bitter failure. Naomi knew the taste well, even if she hadn't swallowed cheap air in a decade. She sold the rusted-out husk of an industrial garage to a desperate father for pennies, writing it off as a corporate tax rounding error. She thought she was dumping a toxic asset. She didn't know the junk she casually signed away held a buried secret that would completely shatter her pristine reality. Heat radiated off the cracked asphalt in shimmering, oily waves. Naomi stood beside the dented bumper of her town car, her $600 leather heels grinding into a slurry of dried motor oil and dead crabgrass. She hated this part of the city. It didn't just look poor, it felt infectious. The structure in front of her barely qualified as a building. It was a rotting carcass of corrugated iron and shattered cinder block, slumped at the dead end of an industrial cul-de-sac. Faded yellow paint peeled from the rolling bay door like sunburned skin. The air smelled of sulfur, damp rot, and decades of spilled antifreeze. Naomi checked her watch. A platinum Patek Philippe. The metal was cool against her wrist, a sharp contrast to the suffocating afternoon heat. She was the CEO of Croft Holdings, an acquisitions firm that swallowed city blocks whole and digested them into high-rise condominiums. This plot, however, was a geographic anomaly, a useless trapezoid of contaminated dirt, boxed in by active freight tracks and a municipal sewage processing plant. It was a dead asset. "You're late," she said, not bothering to look up from her tablet, as a rusted Ford pickup coughed its way into the lot. The truck's engine sputtered, dieseling for a few seconds after the key was turned, before finally dying with a metallic shudder. The driver's side door groaned open. Arthur stepped out. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would buy a condemned garage in an unzoned wasteland. He wore faded denim work pants, stained at the knees, and a grey t-shirt clinging to his shoulders with sweat. Dust was ground into the lines of his face, making him look older than his 30-something years. His hands were thick, knuckles scarred, fingertips permanently stained with grease. "Traffic on the I-95, Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't sound apologetic, just tired. Naomi swiped a finger across her screen. "The contract is standard, as is condition. Croft Holdings claims zero liability for any structural failures, soil toxicity, or municipal fines incurred post-transfer. You're buying the dirt and the scrap metal sitting on it." Arthur didn't look at the tablet. He looked at the garage. His jaw worked, a muscle ticking under his beard. He wasn't looking at the rot. He was looking at the square footage. He needed space. Space meant he could take in more repair jobs. More jobs meant he could afford to keep the lights on in his apartment. A small face appeared in the passenger window of the truck. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with tangled brown hair and a smudge of dirt across her nose. She pressed her hands against the glass, staring at Naomi's sharp, tailored suit with wide, blinking eyes. Naomi looked away. She didn't do kids. Kids were variables. Kids were emotional leverage, and she despised anything that clouded a clean transaction. "I brought the cashier's check," Arthur said. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. It was bent at the corners, stained with a thumbprint of engine oil. He handed it over. Naomi didn't take it. She nodded to her assistant, a silent, suited man standing by the town car, who stepped forward with a pair of sterile white gloves, took the envelope, and verified the check inside. $12,000, Naomi said, her tone flat. "For this." She gestured toward the sagging roof. "I have to ask, Mr. Pendleton, are you a masochist or just bad at math? The demolition alone will cost you double what you just paid me." Arthur stepped closer. He smelled like cheap laundry detergent, old sweat, and stale coffee. I'm not tearing it down, I'm fixing it. Naomi let out a short, breathy laugh that held no humor. You can't fix structural rot. The foundation is cracked. The soil is poisoned. It's junk. It's mine, Arthur corrected softly. He took the stylus her assistant offered and scrawled his name on the digital pad. His signature was jagged, hurried. He handed the stylus back, his dark eyes meeting Naomi's for the first time. They weren't the eyes of a beaten man. They were the eyes of a cornered animal that had finally found a den. "Have a nice life, Mr. Pendleton," Naomi said, turning on her heel. She got into the air-conditioned sanctuary of her car, the heavy door sealing out the smell of the junkyard with a solid, expensive thud. As the car pulled away, she looked out the tinted window. Arthur had opened the passenger door of his truck. He was lifting the little girl out, settling her on his hip, and pointing toward the rusted monstrosity. Naomi looked down at her tablet, deleting the property file from her database. It was gone. Not her problem anymore. Blisters don't form right away. They start as a hot, localized friction, a warning beneath the skin, before fluid rushes in to protect the raw flesh beneath. Arthur had 4 on his right hand and 3 on his left. He popped them with the tip of a utility knife, wiping the clear fluid on his jeans, and picked up the crowbar again. It was day 7. The inside of the garage was worse than the outside. The previous owners hadn't just abandoned it, they had used it as a dumping ground. Arthur spent the first 4 days hauling out rotting tiles, shattered wooden pallets, and heavy, rust-fused engine blocks that he had to drag by, chaining them to his truck's rear axle. Dust hung in the air like a thick, brown fog. Every time he swung the sledgehammer or pried up a piece of junk, a new cloud plumed upward, catching the sharp beams of sunlight slicing through the bullet holes in the corrugated roof. "Daddy, I found a shiny." Arthur paused, lowering the crowbar. Sweat stung his eyes, blurring his vision. He wiped his face with a filthy forearm and turned. Chloe was sitting on a relatively clean patch of concrete near the open bay door, safely away from the jagged metal. She was wearing a pair of his oversized protective goggles, which swallowed half her face. In her small hands, she held up a large, heavy steel nut. It wasn't shiny. It was coated in thick, black sludge. "That's a good one, Bug," Arthur grunted, trying to keep the exhaustion out of his voice. "Put it in the treasure bucket." Chloe beamed, dropping the greasy nut into a plastic yellow beach pail with a loud clack. Arthur turned back to the back corner of the garage. This section was different. The rest of the floor was poured concrete, cracked and heaving from frost and neglect. But here, in a 10 by 10 square in the darkest corner, the floor was covered in heavy, bolted diamond plate steel. It was covered in decades of grime, and Arthur had only noticed it because his boot had caught on a raised bolt head. He assumed it was an old inspection pit, filled in and covered up. If he could pry the plates up, he might have a ready-made mechanic's pit, saving him thousands in concrete cutting. He knelt, wedging the flattened end of the crowbar under the lip of the first steel plate. He threw his weight against the iron bar. It didn't budge. He swore under his breath. The bolts were rusted solid, fused into the concrete. He grabbed a can of penetrating oil, spraying it heavily over the rusty bolt heads. The sharp, chemical smell of aerosol and solvents cut through the stale air. He let it soak, drinking lukewarm water from a plastic jug while he waited, watching Chloe stack old spark plugs like building blocks. 30 minutes later, he fired up a portable angle grinder. The shrill, agonizing scream of metal on metal echoed off the tin walls, sending sparks cascading over his boots in a brilliant orange fountain. The smell of burning steel filled the air, acrid and sharp. He ground off the heads of 6 heavy bolts. Then he wedged the crowbar back under the lip. Arthur took a deep breath, planted his boots on the concrete, and pulled. The muscles in his forearms coiled tightly, veins pressing against his skin. His lower back screamed in protest. With a loud, metallic shriek, the seal broke. The heavy steel plate tilted upward. Arthur grabbed the edge with his gloved hands and heaved it over. It hit the floor with a deafening crash that made Chloe jump and cover her ears. Arthur stood panting, staring down into the dark. It wasn't an inspection pit. A rush of cold, damp air hit his face. It smelled completely different from the garage. It didn't smell like oil or rust. It smelled sweet, earthy, and ancient. It smelled like damp oak wood and dark, fermented sugar. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam down into the square hole. Concrete stairs led downward into a dry, brick-lined sub-basement. The air down here was remarkably cool, insulated by the earth and sealed by the steel plate for what had to be decades. Arthur lowered himself into the hole, his boots echoing sharply on the concrete steps. "Stay up there, Chloe," he called back, his voice bouncing off the tight brick walls. "Don't come near the edge." He reached the bottom. The space was massive, easily the entire footprint of the garage above. But it wasn't empty. The flashlight beam cut through the pitch-black darkness, reflecting off rows and rows of massive wooden barrels. They were stacked 3 high, nestled in heavy wooden cradles. Dust lay over everything like a thick grey blanket, undisturbed for nearly a century. Arthur stepped closer, wiping a layer of dust off the face of the nearest barrel. Burned into the old dark oak were words. Distilled 1921. Kentucky straight. Uncut. Arthur's breath hitched. He wasn't a drinker. But he knew what prohibition was. He knew what a speakeasy stash looked like. This wasn't a few bottles of bootleg gin. This was an entire subterranean warehouse of untouched, century-old bourbon. There had to be 200 casks down here. He reached out, tracing the grain of the wood. The barrel was solid, heavy. He knocked a knuckle against it, and it gave a deep, dull thud. It was full. Arthur's knees suddenly felt weak. The crushing weight of his past-due bills, the fear of losing Chloe, the gnawing anxiety that kept him awake every single night. It all collided with the heavy, sweet scent of aged alcohol. He slumped back against a brick pillar, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor, staring at the barrels as a strange, rusty sound clawed its way out of his throat. He was laughing. Naomi sat at the head of a long, mahogany conference table, nursing a cup of espresso that tasted like battery acid. The boardroom was suspended 40 stories above the city, walled in floor-to-ceiling glass. It was sterile, quiet, and climate-controlled to exactly 69 degrees. She was currently listening to her head of acquisitions drone on about zoning permits in the warehouse district, but her mind was entirely elsewhere. Her phone buzzed against the table. A sharp, angry vibration. She glanced down. It was a text from Harrison, her chief scout and fixer. "Need you to call me. Now. It's about the junkyard on 4th. Naomi frowned, subtly picking up the phone. She typed with one hand under the table. "Sold it last week. Not our problem." The reply was instantaneous. "It is. You need to see this. Turn on Channel 8. Naomi held up a hand, cutting off her head of acquisitions mid-sentence. "Mute the presentation. Put the news on the screen." The executive blinked, confused, but tapped a button on his remote. The pie charts vanished, replaced by a live local news broadcast. The camera showed a familiar, depressing background. Chain-link fences, train tracks, and the rusted yellow tin of the garage she had practically given away 7 days ago. But it wasn't quiet anymore. Police tape surrounded the property. 2 armored security trucks were backed up to the bay doors. Men in tactical gear were standing guard, while a team of appraisers in white coveralls carefully wheeled something out on a heavy hand truck. It was a large oak barrel. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Historic Hall, Prohibition-era vault, discovered in abandoned garage." Naomi's blood went completely cold. The anchor's voice echoed through the boardroom speakers. Experts are calling it the find of the century. Over 200 pristine casks of high-proof bourbon, sealed beneath a false floor since the 1920s. Auction houses are already estimating the value of a single bottle at upward of $50,000. The total haul could easily exceed $30 million. The boardroom went dead silent. Every head turned slowly to look at Naomi. $30 million, someone whispered. Naomi didn't react. She kept her face entirely blank, a mask of cold porcelain, even as her stomach violently twisted into a tight, sickening knot. She had sold the property for $12,000. She had looked at the grimy man with the dirty fingernails and the sticky child, and she had felt superior. She had signed away a $30 million vault because she couldn't be bothered to order a deep soil structural survey on a junk asset. "Meeting adjourned," Naomi said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. She stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out before anyone could see the white-hot fury burning in her eyes. An hour later, her black town car pulled back into the industrial cul-de-sac. The scene was chaotic. News vans were parked haphazardly on the curbs. Curious onlookers pressed against the chain-link fence. The smell of the sewage plant was completely overpowered by the scent of exhaust and the heavy, sweet aroma of ancient oak that had drifted up from the open vault. Naomi stepped out of her car. She didn't care about the oil on her shoes this time. She pushed her way through a cluster of reporters, flashing a corporate badge to a bewildered police officer to duck under the yellow tape. She found him sitting on the tailgate of his rusted Ford. Arthur wasn't talking to the press. He wasn't celebrating. He was sitting quietly, eating a limp ham sandwich wrapped in foil. Chloe was sitting beside him, swinging her legs, drinking from a juice box. He still looked exhausted. The dust was still ground into the lines of his face, but the desperation was gone. The frantic, cornered animal look in his dark eyes had vanished, replaced by a deep, immovable calm. Naomi walked up to the truck. She stopped 3 feet away, staring at him. Her chest tightened. She expected him to gloat. She expected him to throw her words back in her face. Arthur chewed, swallowed, and looked down at her. He didn't smile. He just wiped a smear of mustard from his thumb. "You want a sandwich?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Chloe didn't finish hers. Naomi stared at him, entirely thrown off balance. Her brain, wired for cutthroat corporate warfare, couldn't process the utter lack of malice in his offer. "You knew?" she accused, her voice tight, dropping all pretense. "You knew it was down there." Arthur let out a soft huff, shaking his head. "Lady, if I knew there was $30 million buried in the dirt, you think I would have rolled up in a truck with a slipping transmission to buy it? Then how—" She gestured vaguely to the chaotic scene behind them, the armored trucks loading up the casks. "You didn't do a survey. You just bought it." "I bought it because it had 4 walls and a roof," Arthur said simply. He looked past her, watching the heavy barrels being loaded. "I was going to build a life here. Just happened to be one waiting for me." Naomi felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation in her chest. It wasn't just the sting of a lost asset. It was the realization of her own cynicism. She had looked at this place and this man and saw nothing but worthlessness. She had judged a book not just by its cover, but by the dirt on its spine. "I could tie this up in court," Naomi lied, her voice lacking its usual venom. "I could claim the mineral and salvage rights weren't explicitly transferred." Arthur finally smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a tired, knowing expression. "You could try, but your contract was real specific about you taking zero liability for whatever was in the dirt. My lawyer said you basically built me an ironclad fortress." He hopped off the tailgate, his heavy boots hitting the asphalt. He reached up, lifting Chloe down and setting her on the ground. "You live in a world where everything has a price tag, Miss Croft," Arthur said, turning back to her. He picked up his battered yellow plastic bucket, the one Chloe had been playing with, and handed it to the little girl. "You look at dirt and you just see dirt. Sometimes you gotta be willing to get your hands dirty to see what's underneath." Naomi stood completely still as Arthur turned his back on her, holding his daughter's hand as they walked toward a sleek, black security vehicle, waiting to escort them. The chaotic noise of the news crews and police radios seemed to fade into a dull hum. She looked down at her $600 shoes, stained with grease and dust. For the first time in her life, the billionaire CEO didn't feel superior. She just felt utterly, painfully poor. Panic doesn't always come with a racing heart and gasping breaths. Sometimes it is perfectly still. It creeps into your stomach like swallowing a block of ice and sits there, radiating a slow, paralyzing cold. Arthur sat in a leather chair that cost more than his last 3 trucks combined. The office belonged to Thomas Hayes, a wealth management attorney recommended by the auction house. The room smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and money. It was a sterile, hushed silence, the kind that only existed above the 50th floor of a downtown high-rise. After federal capital gains, state taxes, and the auction house's premium, you are looking at a net liquid transfer of $18.4 million, Thomas said. He pushed a heavy, cream-colored document across the mahogany desk. "Sign here, Mr. Pendleton. And here." Arthur stared at the Mont Blanc pen resting on the paper. He didn't pick it up. His hands were shaking. Just a tremor, barely visible, but he could feel the vibration deep in his carpal bones. He had spent his entire adult life surviving on a razor's edge. He knew how to stretch a $20 bill over 4 days of groceries. He knew which utility bills could bounce 1 month without the power getting shut off. Poverty was a violent, exhausting ocean. But he knew how to tread water in it. This was outer space. There was no gravity here. There were no rules, he understood. "Arthur?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but laced with the inherent condescension of a man who wore custom Italian wool. "Is there a problem with the trust structure?" "No," Arthur rasped. He cleared his throat, trying to dislodge the dry dust of his old life that still felt stuck there. He picked up the pen. It was too heavy. It felt ridiculous in his calloused, permanently stained fingers. He signed his name. The ink flowed smoothly, silently. No scratching. He didn't feel rich. He felt like a target. Every time his phone rang, he expected it to be a long-lost cousin, a scammer, or the government claiming a clerical error. He hadn't slept in 3 days. When he closed his eyes, he saw the blinding flashes of the news cameras and heard the invasive shouting of reporters who had camped outside his crappy apartment until he had to hire private security to smuggle Chloe to school. "Congratulations," Thomas smiled, offering a manicured hand. Arthur shook it. His grip was too tight, rough against the lawyer's soft skin. He walked out of the office, stepping into the elevator. The descent made his stomach drop. $18 million. He could buy a private island. He could buy a fleet of sports cars. Instead, he walked out of the glass lobby, got into his rented, inconspicuous grey sedan, and drove to a hardware store. He walked the aisles, breathing in the smell of cut lumber, PVC glue, and fertilizer. He bought a pack of sandpaper and a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. He just needed to hold something real. Miles away, the atmosphere in the Croft Holdings boardroom was thick enough to choke on. Naomi stood at the head of the table. The panoramic view of the city behind her was a grey, overcast smear. The temperature in the room was set to 69 degrees, but a thin, cold sweat pricked the back of her neck beneath her silk collar. Richard, a senior board member with skin like an old iguana and a smile that never reached his dead eyes, tossed a printed quarterly report onto the table. It landed with a heavy, insulting slap. $30 million, Naomi, Richard said softly. His voice was a rasping purr. We are in the business of asset extraction. We buy the land, we scrape the value, we build. We do not hand a lottery ticket to a vagrant because our CEO was too impatient to order a standard ground-penetrating radar scan. It was an unzoned, toxic lot, surrounded by municipal waste. Naomi fired back, her voice ringing off the glass walls. She didn't flinch. If you flinched in this room, they smelled blood. The soil toxicity reports from the 90s explicitly stated the ground was unstable. A deep scan would have cost $50,000 on a property we acquired for a fraction of that in a bulk portfolio. It was an executive efficiency call. An efficiency call, Richard mocked, looking around the table. Several board members averted their eyes. The press is having a field day. Billionaire firm accidentally funds working-class hero. We don't just look incompetent, Naomi. We look stupid. Naomi pressed her manicured nails into the palms of her hands, under the table, until they left crescent moon indentations. I will recover the optics. I am launching a philanthropic initiative in the industrial sector. We rebrand the oversight as a purposeful community injection. Don't insult my intelligence, Richard sneered. He leaned forward. The board is convening for a vote of no confidence on Thursday. You have 3 days to figure out how to stop the bleeding, or we restructure. Without you. Naomi stared at him. She didn't blink. Noted. She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors. She kept her spine rigid, her chin high, until she reached the private sanctuary of her office. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The silence rushed in. Naomi walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Her chest heaved in a sharp, jagged breath. She was losing her grip. Croft Holdings was her entire identity. It was the armor she had built to ensure no one could ever make her feel small or powerless again. And it was cracking. Not because of a hostile takeover or a market crash, but because of a dirty garage and a mechanic who smelled like stale coffee. She walked to her desk, swiping her monitor awake. She pulled up the dossier Harrison had compiled on Arthur Pendleton. She scrolled through the pages of his life. Unpaid medical bills from 3 years ago. A late wife. A string of minimum wage repair jobs. She stared at a surveillance photo of Arthur coming out of a hardware store, holding a $3 pack of sandpaper. He had $18 million in the bank, and he was buying sandpaper. Naomi narrowed her eyes. She couldn't understand him. And Naomi Croft despised things she couldn't understand. Fresh asphalt smells like hot tar and burnt ozone. It is a harsh, chemical scent. But to Arthur, it smelled like a clean slate. He stood in the center of a massive, warehouse-style building on the outskirts of the city. He hadn't bought a mansion in the hills. He had bought a defunct commercial airplane hangar, nestled against a quiet stretch of county highway. The roof didn't leak. The foundation was reinforced concrete, poured thick enough to hold a Boeing. Sparks rained down from the ceiling as a team of welders installed a heavy-duty hydraulic lift. The deafening whine of a concrete saw echoed from the back corner where they were cutting out a pit. Arthur wore his old denim work pants, though they were clean now, and a plain black t-shirt. He had a clipboard in his hand, checking off electrical conduit installations. He still felt the phantom weight of anxiety. But here, surrounded by the noise of progress, the ice in his stomach melted into a manageable puddle. Tires crunched on the gravel outside the open hangar doors. Arthur looked up. A sleek black town car idled in the sunshine. The back door opened, and Naomi stepped out. She looked entirely out of place, a sharp blade of corporate precision cutting through the dusty construction site. She wore a charcoal grey pantsuit, tailored to a mathematical perfection, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, immovable knot. She stepped carefully over a coil of thick copper wire, her eyes scanning the cavernous space. Arthur's jaw tightened. He handed his clipboard to his foreman. "Take a break, guys," he called out. The heavy machinery powered down, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Arthur wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his back pocket and walked slowly toward the hangar doors. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Miss Croft," Arthur said. He didn't offer a greeting. He stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms. Naomi stopped, looking up at the high steel trusses. "I expected you to be in a penthouse in Monaco by now, Mr. Pendleton, not inhaling concrete dust in another warehouse. Monaco doesn't have a good school district for Chloe," Arthur replied dryly. "What do you want? If this is about the auction, my lawyers told your lawyers to stop calling." Naomi looked at him. Really looked at him. He didn't look exhausted anymore. The grey pallor of constant stress had faded from his skin, replaced by a ruddy, sun-baked health. But his eyes were still guarded, hard as flint. "I'm not here about the bourbon," Naomi said. She hated the slight hesitation in her voice. She was used to controlling the cadence of every conversation. "I'm here to offer you an equity partnership." Arthur laughed, a short, blunt sound. "You want to partner with me, the guy you called a masochist who was bad at math?" Naomi's expression remained perfectly flat, but a flush of heat crept up her neck. "Circumstances have changed. You have capital, I have infrastructure. You are building a high-end automotive restoration facility here. I can see the blueprints on the table over there. You need supply chains, import licenses for vintage parts, zoning permits for hazardous materials. Croft Holdings can bypass years of municipal red tape for a 20% equity stake." Arthur stared at her. He pulled the rag from his pocket and slowly wiped a smudge of grease off his thumb. "You're bleeding," Arthur said quietly. Naomi blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're bleeding," he repeated, gesturing vaguely toward her. "Not literally. But I know what desperation looks like. I've looked at it in the mirror every morning for 5 years. You don't want 20% of a mechanic's shop. You need a headline. You need to show your board that you didn't lose $30 million. You simply pivoted it into a lucrative joint venture." Naomi's breath caught. She felt a sudden, violent urge to slap him, followed immediately by a terrifying sense of exposure. He had dismantled her entire strategy in 30 seconds. "Business is mutual exploitation, Arthur. That's all it is," Naomi said, her voice dropping its professional veneer, revealing a sharp, jagged edge. "I get my headline, you get a frictionless launch for your little passion project. Everybody wins." "I don't play those games," Arthur said, his voice hardening. "I don't exploit people. I fix broken things. You break things down to sell the pieces. We don't mix." "You think you're above it now?" Naomi snapped, taking a step closer. The smell of her expensive perfume, something sharp, floral and cold, clashed with the scent of hot metal and dust. "You think $18 million makes you a saint? It just makes you a mark. The sharks are circling you, Arthur. They will bleed you dry with taxes, bad investments and lawsuits. You need someone like me to protect your perimeter." Arthur didn't back away. He looked down at her, his dark eyes unblinking. "I protected my daughter when I had $12 in my checking account. I think I can handle some guys in suits." He turned away, picking up his clipboard. "Show yourself out, Naomi. Mind the gravel. It ruins nice shoes." Naomi stood frozen as he walked back into the depths of the hangar. The dismissal stung worse than a slap. It wasn't just a rejection. It was total indifference. He didn't care about her power. He didn't fear her. She walked back to her car, her stomach churning with a toxic mix of anger and something else she refused to identify. Envy. She got into the back seat, slamming the door. The heavy thud isolated her in the silent, leather-lined interior. She was surrounded by luxury, completely insulated from the outside world, and for the first time, she felt entirely trapped. Rain drummed heavily against the thick, reinforced skylights of the hangar. It was a torrential downpour, the kind that turned the city streets into black, slick rivers. The sound was rhythmic, isolating, drumming a heavy beat against the vast metal roof. It was 11 p.m. Arthur sat on a rolling stool in the center of the dark hangar. The only light came from a single, caged halogen work lamp hanging over the hood of a 1969 Mustang Mach-1. The car was a rusted skeleton, stripped down to the bare chassis. He held a socket wrench in his right hand, but he wasn't turning anything. He was just staring at the rusted engine mounts. A half-empty bottle of generic bourbon, the $15 kind with a plastic screw cap, sat on a metal utility cart next to him. Beside it was a small, framed photograph. It was Chloe, a year old, sitting on the lap of a woman with bright, laughing eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves. Sarah. Arthur reached out, his grease-stained fingers lightly brushing the glass over the photo. The cold, hard truth of wealth was setting in. He had paid off the medical debt that had bankrupted them, trying to save her. He had secured Chloe's college fund. He had built the shop Sarah always told him to build. And she was still dead. The money hadn't brought her back. It hadn't fixed the hollow, aching cavity in his chest. It had just removed the daily distraction of survival, leaving him alone with the raw, unmedicated grief. He took a swig straight from the plastic bottle. The cheap liquor burned a harsh, welcomed trail down his throat. A loud, metallic clatter echoed from the front of the hangar. Arthur jumped, the stool rolling backward. He grabbed a heavy steel crowbar off the cart, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stepped out of the pool of halogen light, letting the darkness swallow him as he moved silently toward the front pedestrian door. Someone was struggling with the lock. The door suddenly clicked, blown open by a gust of wind and rain. A figure stumbled inside, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind them, leaning back against it, gasping for air. Arthur raised the crowbar. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice echoing loudly. The figure flinched, holding up a hand. Don't hit me." Arthur lowered the bar slowly. He recognized the voice. He walked over, hitting a switch on the wall. A bank of fluorescent lights flickered on, buzzing violently before bathing the entrance in harsh white light. Naomi Croft stood dripping on the concrete floor. She was a mess. The immaculate CEO armor was shattered. Her trench coat was soaked, clinging to her. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe knot, was plastered against her pale face in wet, tangled strands. She wasn't wearing her expensive heels. She was barefoot, holding the ruined leather shoes in one hand. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue. Arthur stared in utter disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" Naomi looked around, her eyes wild, unfocused. She looked like she was in shock. "I drove," she mumbled, her teeth chattering. "I drove myself. I didn't call the driver. I just drove. I didn't know where to go." Arthur frowned, the irritation fading into a sharp prick of concern. He set the crowbar down. "Where's your car?" "In a ditch," she said, letting out a hollow, broken laugh. "About 2 miles back. Blew a tire, spun out. I walked." She slid down the heavy steel door, sitting on the cold concrete floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The billionaire CEO, reduced to a shivering, drenched pile in the corner of a mechanic's shop. Arthur sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. He walked into the small office he had framed out in the corner and came back a moment later with a thick, grey moving blanket. He walked over and draped it roughly over her shoulders. "Hold this," he ordered. He walked back to his utility cart, grabbed the plastic bottle of cheap bourbon, and brought it over. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. Naomi stared at the bottle. "Is that—" "No, it's not the $50,000 stuff you signed away," Arthur said bluntly. "It's rot gut. Drink it. It'll raise your core temp." Naomi took the bottle with trembling hands. She took a small sip and instantly gagged, coughing violently as the cheap alcohol burned her throat. "Jesus," she rasped, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Yeah, well, we can't all drink single malt," Arthur muttered, sitting down on an overturned plastic bucket a few feet away. He crossed his arms, watching her shiver beneath the heavy blanket. "What happened, Naomi? And don't give me a corporate press release." Naomi pulled the blanket tighter. The silence stretched, filled only by the heavy drumming of the rain on the roof. Her defenses were completely washed away. She didn't have the energy to lie. "They fired me," she said quietly. The word sounded completely alien in her mouth. Arthur didn't react. He just waited. "Richard called an emergency vote," Naomi continued, her voice trembling, not just from the cold, but from a deep, seismic rage. "They used the garage. They said I showed a pattern of impulsive, detrimental decision-making. But it was just an excuse. They've wanted me out for a year because I wouldn't let them gut the pension funds of the companies we acquired. I built that firm. I made them billions, and they threw me out like trash." She looked up at Arthur, her eyes rimmed with red. "I lost everything today." Arthur looked at her, his expression unreadable. He looked back over his shoulder, toward the pool of light illuminating the rusted Mustang and the small framed photo sitting next to his tools. "No, you didn't," Arthur said softly, his gravelly voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "You lost a job. You lost a title. It was my whole life," Naomi whispered, burying her face in her knees. "It's all I had." Arthur stood up. He walked over to her, his heavy boots scuffing the concrete. He reached down and took the bottle of bourbon from her slack grip. "Then your life was cheap," Arthur said, taking a sip from the bottle himself. He didn't cough. "You spent your whole life building a fortress out of money, Naomi. But money is just concrete. It doesn't love you back. It doesn't hold your hand when you're dying. It just sits there, cold." Naomi lifted her head. She expected a lecture. She expected him to gloat. But his eyes were just infinitely sad. "I have $18 million in a bank account right now," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly. He gestured to the empty, cavernous hangar. "And I'm sitting here on a Tuesday night, drinking cheap whiskey, talking to the woman who tried to screw me over, because the only person I want to talk to is buried in a cemetery 3 towns over. And all the money in the world can't buy me 5 minutes with her." Naomi stared at him. The harsh, fluorescent light highlighted the deep lines around his eyes, the permanent exhaustion that wealth hadn't erased. For the first time, Naomi didn't see an asset, a liability, or a demographic. She saw a mirror. She saw a man who was just as broken, just as terrified, and just as hollow as she felt right now. She let out a long, shaky breath, leaning her head back against the steel door. The cold dampness of her clothes seeped into her bones, but the frantic, crushing panic in her chest began to ease. "Do you have any dry clothes?" Naomi asked quietly. The fight completely drained out of her. Arthur looked down at her. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of a truce. "I've got a clean pair of coveralls. They're going to be huge on you." "I don't care," Naomi said, closing her eyes. "Just make me look like I belong in a garage." Morning arrived without the muted, climate-controlled grace Naomi was accustomed to. It broke violently through the hangar's reinforced skylights in harsh, unedited shafts of pale light. Dust motes danced in the beams, thick and chaotic. She woke up on a battered faux leather sofa in Arthur's makeshift office, her neck violently cramped. Her mouth tasted like copper and cheap, fermented corn. She sat up, the heavy canvas of Arthur's spare coveralls swallowing her frame. The sleeves were rolled up 3 times, and the hem dragged past her bare feet. Her expensive trench coat was draped over a folding chair, stiff with dried mud. For 10 seconds, the disorientation was absolute. She wasn't in her penthouse. She wasn't preparing for an 8 a.m. conference call. She was jobless, effectively exiled, waking up in a cavernous steel shed, smelling of vulcanized rubber and old engine oil. A sharp, pneumatic hiss shattered the quiet, followed by the deafening rattle of an impact wrench. Naomi flinched. She swung her legs off the sofa, her bare feet hitting the cold concrete floor. She walked out of the framed-in office, hugging her arms across her chest to ward off the morning chill. Arthur was already at work. He was under the lift, bathed in the yellow glow of a drop light, wrestling with the rusted exhaust manifold of a 1980s pickup truck. Chloe was sitting at a workbench 20 feet away, wearing oversized noise-cancelling headphones, coloring furiously in a book with a nubby blue crayon. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was checking the stock ticker. The world had ended for Naomi yesterday. But here, the gears were still grinding forward. "Coffee's in the pot," Arthur called out, his voice muffled by the metal chassis above him. He didn't even look out from under the truck. "Cups are on the shelf. Wipe 'em out first. Dust gets everywhere." Naomi walked over to a scarred folding table holding a cheap plastic coffee maker. The glass pot was stained brown. She found a ceramic mug, wiped a thin layer of grit from the rim with her thumb, and poured. The liquid was pitch black and smelled like burned earth. She took a sip. It was acidic, bitter, and completely devoid of comfort. She drank half of it in one gulp. She walked over to the lift and stood there. Arthur rolled out on his creeper, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked up at her, taking in the absurd picture she painted in his massive grey coveralls. "You look like a hostage," he observed dryly. "I feel like one," Naomi replied, her voice raspy. She looked down at her hands. The manicured nails were still perfect, a glaring reminder of a life that no longer existed. "My phone has 47 missed calls, mostly from journalists, a few from my lawyers." Richard pushed the press release at midnight. They cited a mutual separation due to divergent strategic visions. Arthur grunted, sitting up and tossing a heavy socket onto a metal tray with a sharp clatter. "Corporate for we threw her out a window." "Precisely." Naomi stared at the tray of tools, wrenches, ratchets, pliers, heavy, solid things made of chrome and vanadium, things that had a singular, undeniable purpose. You turn the bolt tightens, cause and effect. "What are you doing?" she asked, pointing at the truck. "Replacing a catalytic converter," Arthur said. "Guy uses this rig for landscaping. Needs it back by Tuesday, or he misses out on 3 contracts. So I'm cutting out the rot." Naomi looked at the rusted pipe protruding from the undercarriage. It looked hopelessly fused, a decayed mess of flaking orange metal. "How do you fix something that's broken?" Arthur looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, catching the double meaning. He didn't offer a platitude. He walked over to a red rolling cart, grabbed an angle grinder, and plugged it into a heavy yellow extension cord. "You don't fix rot," Arthur said, holding the grinder up. "You cut it out. You grind it down to bare metal until you find something solid enough to weld fresh steel onto." He handed the heavy tool to her. Naomi blinked, instinctively taking it. It was heavy, bottom-heavy from the motor, the abrasive cutting wheel feeling like coarse sandpaper against her palm. "Put on those safety glasses," Arthur instructed, pointing a greasy finger at a scratched plastic pair on the cart. "And the leather gloves, not the thin ones, the heavy welders." Naomi set her coffee down. A strange, rebellious spark ignited in her chest. She had spent a decade moving invisible money, building empires out of digital signatures and empty promises. She wanted to break something real, She pulled the thick, stiff leather gloves over her hands and snapped the scratched goggles over her eyes. Arthur walked her to a scrap piece of rusted quarter panel clamped to a sawhorse's. "Hold it tight. It's going to kick. Press the trigger. Let the wheel spin up to speed. Then lay the edge into the rust. Don't force it. Let the machine do the work." Naomi gripped the handle. Her heart thumped a strange, erratic rhythm. She squeezed the heavy plastic trigger. The grinder roared to life with a violent torque that violently twisted her wrists. She gasped, staggering a half step, but held on. The whine of the electric motor was deafening. "Breathe!" Arthur yelled over the noise, standing close, his large hands hovering just inches from hers, ready to catch the tool if she dropped it. "Bring it down. Angle it." Naomi brought the spinning disc down onto the rusted steel. The collision was explosive. A brilliant, blinding shower of orange sparks cascaded off the metal, bouncing against the heavy canvas of her coveralls. The vibration shot up her forearms, rattling her teeth, jarring her bones. The smell of hot, burning iron and oxidized decay hit her nose. Sharp, industrial, and violent. She pressed harder. The rust began to flake and disintegrate, flying away in a cloud of brown dust, revealing a streak of shining, unblemished silver steel beneath. "Keep it moving," Arthur barked, a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Don't dig a trench, sweep it." Naomi swept her arms. The sparks flew in a wide arc. Her shoulders burned. The vibration numbed her fingers inside the thick leather gloves. But beneath the noise and the physical strain, the agonizing, suffocating knot of anxiety in her chest completely unraveled. She was destroying the decay. She was making something clean. She released the trigger. The grinder spun down with a high-pitched whine, dying into silence. Naomi stood panting, her breath fogging the plastic safety glasses. Her arms were trembling uncontrollably. She pulled the goggles off. Her face was smeared with dark soot, her immaculate hair a frizzy, tangled mess. She looked at the patch of shining silver steel amidst the orange rot. A ragged, breathless laugh ripped out of her throat. It wasn't a polite corporate chuckle. It was a raw, ugly sound of pure release. Arthur leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, watching her. "Cheaper than therapy," he said. Naomi looked at him, her chest heaving, a genuine smile breaking across her dirt-streaked face. "Give me another piece." 3 weeks evaporated into the smell of degreaser and ozone. Naomi didn't go back to her penthouse. She hired a service to pack her clothes and move them to an extended-stay hotel 3 miles from the hangar. She ignored the emails from headhunters and the passive-aggressive texts from her former colleagues. Instead, she showed up at Arthur's shop at 7 every morning. She didn't know how to rebuild a carburetor, but she knew how supply chains worked. Within a week, she had taken over the small, chaotic desk in Arthur's office. She found out he was paying a 30% markup on imported German car parts because his local distributor was gouging him. Naomi spent 3 days on the phone, weaponizing her corporate venom. She didn't yell. She spoke in a low, terrifyingly calm register, citing interstate commerce regulations, threatening audits, and leveraging bulk shipping loopholes she had memorized years ago. By Friday, she had slashed Arthur's operating overhead by 40% and secured a direct line to a manufacturer in Stuttgart. Arthur walked into the office, wiping his hands on a rag, and stared at the updated ledger on the computer screen. "You realize," Arthur said slowly, tapping a grease-stained finger against the monitor. "You just bullied a multi-million-dollar distribution hub into giving a solo mechanic wholesale priority pricing. They don't even do that for dealerships." Naomi didn't look up from her laptop. She was wearing a pair of dark jeans and a plain grey t-shirt. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by clothes that could survive a stray splash of motor oil. "They were exploiting a localized monopoly," Naomi said, taking a sip of black coffee. She had learned to stomach the cheap stuff. I merely pointed out the legal liabilities of their tiered pricing structure. And I implied I had the State Attorney General on speed dial. Do you? Naomi finally looked up, a dangerous smirk on her lips. I used to play tennis with his ex-wife. He owes me a favor. Arthur laughed, shaking his head. He pulled up a folding chair and sat across from her. The dynamic between them had shifted from hostility to a strange, unspoken codependency. She needed the grounding reality of the shop. He needed someone who understood the financial predators circling his newfound wealth. I got a letter today, Arthur said, his tone shifting. The humor drained out of his voice. He pulled a thick, linen-pressed envelope from his back pocket and tossed it onto the desk. Naomi recognized the heavy stationery immediately. The embossed gold logo of Croft Holdings glared back at her. Her stomach tightened. She picked it up, slicing the seal with a plastic letter opener. She scanned the document. Legalese dense enough to choke a horse. But she didn't need to read every word to understand the intent. She knew how Richard operated. They bought the empty lot adjacent to the hangar, Naomi said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The old chemical processing plant. Yeah. The letter says they're filing for a rezoning permit. They want to turn it into a high-volume municipal waste transfer station, Arthur said, his jaw tightening. They're going to run 200 garbage trucks a day past my front door. The smell, the noise, the runoff. It'll destroy the property value. It'll make running a high-end restoration shop impossible. Nobody is bringing a classic Ferrari to a dump. Naomi dropped the letter. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a white-hot fury. Richard wasn't just building a waste station. He was doing this to spite her. The board knew she was spending time at Arthur's shop. Private investigators were cheap, and Richard was thorough. He couldn't legally take Arthur's $18 million, so he was going to suffocate the life out of the one thing Arthur cared about building. He was salting the earth to make sure Naomi had nowhere to land. He's using a shell company. But this is Richard's playbook, Naomi said, pacing the small office. He buys cheap, toxic land, bribes the local zoning board to reclassify it, and flips it for a municipal contract. My lawyer says we can file an injunction, but Croft Holdings has a legal team the size of a small army. They'll bleed me out in court fees for 5 years. Arthur rubbed his face in exhaustion. I fought my whole life just to get a piece of dry land, Naomi. I'm not losing this shop. Naomi stopped pacing. She looked at Arthur. He looked defeated. The same cornered animal look from the day she sold him the garage was creeping back into his dark eyes. She felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness flare in her chest. For years she had fought only for herself, for her stock portfolio, for her ego. But looking at Arthur, and glancing out of the office window at Chloe, playing with a socket set on the floor, she realized she was willing to burn her old empire to the ground to protect this dirty, drafty hangar. They won't bleed you, Naomi said, her voice cold as liquid nitrogen. She walked back to the desk, flipping her laptop open. Naomi, you don't work there anymore, Arthur warned. You can't stop a board mandate. I don't need to work there, Naomi said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I wrote the corporate charter for Croft Holdings. I engineered their acquisition protocols. Richard thinks he's fighting a mechanic and a disgraced executive. He forgot that I know exactly where all the bodies are buried. What are you doing? Arthur asked, leaning forward. Richard is rushing the zoning permit, Naomi explained, her eyes darting across lines of code and property records. To expedite a municipal contract for waste transfer, he has to waive the standard deep soil environmental impact study, claiming the land is already sterile. Arthur frowned. Just like he tried to say my garage was sterile. Exactly, Naomi said, a vicious smile pulling at her lips. But I was the one who bought that chemical plant lot for the portfolio 3 years ago. I buried the original toxicity report because it showed active groundwater contamination. If a waste station is built on it, the heavy truck vibrations will fracture the bedrock, leaking the chemicals directly into the city's main reservoir. Arthur stared at her, horrified. You knew that and you just buried it? Naomi paused, her fingers stopping on the keys. A flash of deep shame hit her. Yes, she whispered, looking down. That's who I was, Arthur. I was a monster in a silk suit. But I still have the encrypted original report. She looked back up, her eyes locking onto his. If I leak this report to the EPA and the State Water Board, Croft Holdings doesn't just lose the permit. The federal fines for attempting a cover-up on a public water supply will bankrupt Richard's division. It will trigger a federal investigation into the entire board. If you leak that, Arthur said slowly, they'll know it was you. They'll come after you. Corporate espionage, NDA violations. They could put you in jail, Naomi. Let them try, she said fiercely. I have enough leverage to sink the whole ship. I'm hitting send. Arthur reached out, his rough, scarred hand covering hers on the mousepad. His grip was warm, heavy, and grounding. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We can just move the shop. We have the money. I don't want you destroying yourself for me. Naomi looked at his hand, then up at his face. The rigid walls around her heart, constructed over a lifetime of betrayals and boardrooms, fractured completely. I'm not destroying myself, Naomi said softly. I'm cutting out the rot. She slipped her hand out from under his, pressed the enter key, and sent the email. The fallout was catastrophic, rapid, and deeply satisfying. Within 48 hours, the EPA halted all construction on the adjacent lot. By the end of the week, federal agents were pulling boxes out of Croft Holdings' downtown offices. Richard was forced to resign under threat of federal indictment, and the company's stock plummeted by 22%. Naomi spent 3 days giving depositions to federal prosecutors, leveraging her immunity agreement in exchange for the unredacted files. She walked out of the federal building on a Friday afternoon, exhausted, drained, but feeling lighter than she had in 10 years. When she drove back to the hangar, the heavy steel doors were wide open, letting in the warm evening breeze. Arthur was standing by the 1969 Mustang Mach 1. It was no longer a rusted skeleton. The body was sanded down to smooth, flawless primer. The interior was stripped but clean, and sitting in the engine bay was a fully rebuilt, massive 428 Cobra Jet V8. The chrome valve covers gleamed under the halogen lights. The smell of high-octane fuel and fresh gasket sealant hung heavy in the air. Chloe was sitting on a high stool, eating a popsicle, watching her father with wide eyes. You're just in time, Arthur said as Naomi walked in. He didn't ask about the lawyers. He didn't ask about the company. He just handed her a rag. Naomi walked over, leaning against the fender. Is it ready? Only one way to find out, Arthur murmured. He hadn't started this car in 5 years. It was the car he was supposed to restore with Sarah. When she got sick, he sold the parts to pay for chemo, leaving only the rusted shell. The bourbon money had bought the parts back, but the labor, the bleeding knuckles, the late nights, the meticulous tuning, that was all him. Arthur climbed into the driver's seat. He pumped the gas pedal 3 times, priming the heavy carburetor. He looked through the windshield at Naomi. She nodded. Arthur turned the key. The starter whined, a high mechanical grind that stretched for 1 agonizing second, 2 seconds, 3. It sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence fell over the shop. Arthur rested his forehead against the steering wheel. Naomi walked around to the open driver's side window. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She leaned in, smelling the stale sweat on his shirt and the sharp tang of gasoline. Try again, she said quietly. It hasn't breathed in a long time. It needs to remember how. Arthur let out a long breath. He sat up, gripping the wheel. He pumped the pedal twice more, holding it halfway down, and twisted the key hard. The starter screamed again, fighting the heavy compression of the massive cylinders. A loud backfire cracked like a gunshot, echoing off the steel walls. And then, with a violent shudder that shook the entire chassis, the engine caught. It didn't just start, it roared. The sound was physical, a deep, guttural, deafening thunder that vibrated in Naomi's chest and rattled the tools on the workbenches. Exhaust smoke plumed from the tailpipes, thick and blue, before clearing into a steady, invisible heat haze. Arthur revved the engine. The RPMs spiked with a terrifying, beautiful howl. Chloe cheered, clapping her sticky hands over her ears. Naomi stepped back, a massive, uncontainable smile breaking across her face. She looked at Arthur. He was gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield, tears streaming silently down his dirt-streaked face. He wasn't crying from sadness. He was crying because the silence was finally gone. He had brought it back to life. He shut the engine off. The sudden quiet rang in their ears. The metal ticked and pinged as the engine block heated up, settling into its mounts. Arthur slowly climbed out of the car. He looked at his shaking hands, then wiped his face with a rag, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He walked over to Naomi. He didn't say, "Thank you." Thank you was too small a word for what they had navigated together over the last few months. Instead, he reached out, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. Naomi froze for a fraction of a second. The physical contact was heavy, smelling of exhaust, sweat, and cheap laundry detergent. Then she let out a breath and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face against his shoulder. It wasn't a romance born of fairy tales or corporate acquisitions. It was a collision of two thoroughly broken people who had spent their entire lives surviving in entirely different ways. They were messy, traumatized, and deeply flawed. But standing there in the fading light of the hangar, surrounded by the smell of hot oil and the ticking of a resurrected engine, they finally had something solid to hold on to. Naomi pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "So," she whispered, her voice rough. "What do we fix next?" Arthur looked at the shop, at Chloe swinging her legs on the stool, and then back at the disgraced billionaire who had found her soul in a pile of rust. "Everything," Arthur said. "Naomi and Arthur's journey proves that sometimes you have to lose your entire empire to find out what you're actually made of. True value isn't found in a boardroom. It's built with bare hands, grit, and the courage to cut out the rot to save what matters." If this story about redemption, unexpected alliances, and the ultimate underdog victory resonated with you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that broken things can always be rebuilt. Subscribe and ring the bell for more raw, powerful stories. What would you risk to start over? Comment below.